Thank you to Control Technologies for sponsoring the event today. And of course, thank you to Mary Thumati and Robert Perez, Mary Thumati with SEI and Robert Perez with Atkins for joining us today and sharing their story with us. Before we get started, my name is Tom Gliegert. I'm the president of ITS Georgia. I'm doing something wrong. Well,
You're absolutely
the virtual
fine.
people didn't need to hear me for any of that, so that's okay. My name's Tom Gliegert with Kimley Horn. I'm the president of ITS Georgia, and I'm thrilled to share some of the information with you that we have planned for the rest of the year. We have some exciting content planned for the rest of the year from our programs committee. Emily Dwyer with GDOT, Mary Thumati with SEI, and Farrah Glasgow with Utilicom are running the program committee this year. They're doing a bang-up job so far. Just a quick update on their behalf. In July, we'll be meeting at Monday Night Garage down in the city of Atlanta to talk about freight logistics. Sorry, that's in June. We'll be meeting at Monday Night Garage to talk freight logistics. In July, we'll be hosting a technology vendor roundtable back in Sandy Springs. So look forward to seeing you at those events, and we'll look forward to sharing additional content as the months run on. ITS Georgia is committed to growing the engineering community in Georgia. As such, we'll provide regular updates and sharing news from STEM communities throughout the state. Fortunately, I don't have any updates today, but if you do have any updates that you'd like us to share, please reach out to me at president@itsga.org. Our 2023 annual meeting, which will be taking place in beautiful Jekyll Island from September 24th through the 26th, is about to open for registration. I'm going to kick it over to Holly Painter with KCI really quick. Yes, right over there, to provide a quick update.
I thought you were going to do it for me.
No, I will not.
Oh, yay. There, scan the code. Registration is open after this. And keynote speaker information is on the website, our Sunday night and Monday night events. And if you guys have any questions, just email me. There's anybody on the board. Help you guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Holly. So, yeah, as Holly mentioned, registration for the 2023 annual meeting will open up at about 1 p.m. today. We'll put this back up on the screen as we're departing, so feel free to scan the code, get that early registration cost, and look forward to seeing y'all in Jekyll Island. Additional information on the website, itsga.org. We have a page devoted to the annual meeting, so our keynote speakers there, social events, and the program are all hosted on the website. One additional note, speaking of socials, we do have a social coming up at Topgolf, the Gwinnett County Topgolf location right off of SR 20 at I-85. That's on June 1st. There's one spot available still for that social, so if you're interested in joining us, you can reach out to me and I can get you linked up with that information. So before we get to the content today, I have an update to provide on behalf of our sponsor, Control Technologies. Unfortunately, Tommy and Bobby from Control Technologies were not able to join us today. Control Technologies continues to find innovative solutions to challenging problems in the ITS space throughout the Southeast. Control Technologies is committed to providing technical expertise and quality products that meet your needs. So please take some time to visit their website, cttechnologies.com, or reach out to Tommy and Bobby, who I'm sure most of us are well acquainted with, for information on their latest products and offerings. So on behalf of ITS Georgia, pleased to thank Control Technologies for their continued support of our organization through sponsorship and through attendance and participation. So on to our presentation. I'm going to hand it off to Stephen Foy, who will introduce with the City of Cartersville, who's going to introduce our speakers and moderate our session.
Okay. All right. I'm going to introduce, like I said, two speakers. First, I want to introduce Mary Thumati. She has over 10 years of experience and is the SEI Traffic Division Manager. She has worked substantially at the Transportation Management Center in the Georgia Department of Transportation full-time for over 5 years, when she transitioned to working in more traditional traffic studies and then to working in signal timing. Mary currently leads the research and innovation team for the statewide traffic incident management services contract for GDOT. Also, I want to introduce Roberto Perez. He has over 30 years of professional experience and proven success in the management and delivery of enterprise-wide solutions and large-scale systems engineering initiatives for both public and private sector organizations. Over the past 20 years, Roberto has dedicated his career to providing consulting services on the application of intelligent transportation systems to various states across the United States, as well as in the Middle East. Most recently, Roberto has been focused on leading and supporting several transportation management and operations efforts associated with traffic incident management, safety service patrol, and traffic management center operations for several states. So, with that introduction, Roberto, Mary.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for allowing us to present today. Make sure this is working. All right, so basically what we want to do is talk a little bit about some of the traffic incident management pilot projects under the research and innovation arm of the statewide traffic incident management services contract for Georgia. What we want to do is provide a brief overview of Georgia's traffic incident management program and where pilot projects play a role. Talk a little bit about the life cycle of adopting technologies in an operational setting. Speak to some of the general implementation challenges with pilot projects. We also obviously want to share some details specifically about the pilot project process implemented at Georgia DOT, and then share some examples, and also maybe even touch on an upcoming pilot project in the future here. And then lastly, share some of our lessons learned. Sorry. So kind of before we kick off the presentation, I wanted to kind of quickly cover some background on the statewide traffic incident management services program. First of all, what you're seeing on the slide is a number of areas of responsibility for this contract. Everything from working with the Transportation Management Center in areas of training, leadership, situational awareness, and support, building out traffic incident management across the state, managing the towing and recovery incentive program, supporting the managed lanes operation, as well as supporting the statewide service patrol and roadside assistance maintenance programs, overseeing the traffic incident management enhancement task force, and ensuring that traffic incident management activities are being effectively communicated. In addition, one thing I wanted to highlight, and that's what Mary alluded to when she presented herself as well, when her bio was kicked off, we have a research and innovation area under this particular program. And really there is to basically allow for the study of emerging technologies and any introduction to pilot projects, whether they be tools or technology, software or hardware, that will allow enabling of efficiencies while managing incidents and help promote safety to the public and emergency responders. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Mary to talk more details.
So this is basically what, with our pilot projects, we really looked at the kind of the process of technology adoption, right? So you start off with your research, and then that research, right, it really comes to your products and to technology, and ITS Georgia, ITS, that's right where that heart of all of that is that technology. And then you have your early adopters, right? They're like, hey, this is a fun toy, let's go play with this. And you want to figure that out. And then at that point, you get to that point where, you go from this technology, and then it just becomes practice. It becomes what everyone does. It just becomes standard. And at some point, it's like we can't even remember what we did before that, right? It just becomes so ubiquitous in what you do. And then it goes into your daily operations. It just becomes part of your SOPs. And then from that, you get these ideas for new research, new technology, and you kind of go through this life cycle. Sorry, I meant to go through that. Sorry. But sometimes you kind of have this break. You have this break between what is in early adoption and getting it to practice. You kind of get this like, oh, here's this piece where you get the people who are really, really excited about something, and they get to that point, but then it's hard to convince everyone that's like, this should be the thing that we do. And so one of the things that we really wanted to do with this is to improve that gap, right? And so like talking about what causes that gap, right? There's limitations. there's limitations on how much can we scale this technology? How much do we know about this technology? There's a lack of operational integration, right? So, even if you have a cool thing and a cool technology, if it does not work with your day-to-day operations, that can absolutely prevent it from getting into your day-to-day operations. And at the end of the day, right, all the research, all that technology, all of that stuff, if it just sits on a shelf, if it sits in a lab, if it sits in a college research paper somewhere, it doesn't go anywhere. So, how do we get to that point? A lot of times it's also budgets. A lot of local agencies or DOTs, like, this looks great. This is a great idea. We did not plan for this kind of technology in our budget. Or prioritization, right? Like, there's so many things that agencies have to do and DOTs have to do. And, when you're like, I have to fix the pavement on the road, like, I don't have the priority to maybe do this technology, right? So there's kind of that gap. And so we were trying in our research and innovation group with the STIMS program, we were trying to look for ways of helping bridge that gap. And that's how we kind of came up with pilot projects. Really a way of really capturing how do we combine our technology, our research, and our operations. And so today what we kind of want to do is kind of go through our process, but also go through some case studies. So these were some of the ones that we had done. The ones in green is the ones we're going to talk about in more detail. And what we really did was, these were some of the case studies. So we looked at Carbine and using Waze and that kind of technology. The AID is the automated incident detection. So that was something that we had seen in the past that, it took some time before it became, it was being used. There was like a proof of concept, and it took some time before it became, part of normal day-to-day operations. So those were some of the past ones that, and this has all been through GDOT. But in our past year, we've really worked on our flares, the impact detection system, and upcoming, so this hasn't started yet, but we'll speak a little bit to it, but trying to look at mounted cameras on some of our safety service patrol vehicles. So our first step in this is to identify our technologies and solutions. So, this is ongoing. So this is kind of a diagram that really kind of shows all the different moving parts at a TMC and just in an operations, right? So you have your local, you have your kind of center, your hub of your TMC operations. You've got your districts and the maintenance. You've got your signal operations. You coordinate with your local agencies. You have emergency services and highway safety patrol and all the devices, right, to monitor all these things. You have your cameras and the maintenance of those cameras and your sensors on your roadway for weather alerts and all of that. So in those normal operations, what we're trying to do is look at, talk to people and figure out, hey, where are your problems? And then looking at whatever technology we have, where does this plug in? Where can we how do we meet with the right stakeholders and connect and do that? So then we go from that, and then we go to our pilot project, and then we go toward operations. So then what we really kind of realized was a lot of times when things got piloted and vendors would come in with an idea, people would say like, okay, cool, like this is there, I'll try it out, and then it would move on. But what we really realized is sometimes it didn't work, but there wasn't necessarily good documentation about why it didn't work. So, if we had a new product, then it's like a version of an improved technology. It's like, well, we don't really remember what we did the last time. We just remembered that it didn't work. So we kind of formalized the process, and we added 6 steps. So we have research, so that's kind of like what we do on that process, and we'll go into each of these a little bit more, but at a high level, look at some more other alternatives. We develop, so that's developing our test plan. So we think about how do we want to test this out? How do we want to see if this works for our operational needs? Because again, speaking back to some of those challenges really come in when there's not operational buy-in, right? So then if we develop a test plan, we look at those things, we're making sure that we're looking for that as we pilot it and not just playing around with it. And then we actually go and do the pilot. We actually go figure out what we're doing, how we want to pilot it, how we want to do it. And in each one of these steps, we also have a go, no go. Like if we look at something and we're like, hey, we did the research, it doesn't make sense for us to pilot it, we have an opportunity to say, hey, we're going to stop it right here. We're going to stop it right here. And so in that process, it gives more buy-in to our operational group. Then once we do our pilot, we analyze our results. And so we look at how did that actually work? Were the outcomes what we expected? Were they not? Then if it goes well, if based on the analysis it goes well, we'll do a small deployment. and really kind of look at it at a slightly bigger scale. And at that point, we actually do a handoff, right? And that's an important part of our process, is to make sure that it hands off to, the right people and getting it into operations and giving them the right training and those type of things. So to kind of go through each of our steps, our research step, we conduct background research and we compare products and we do a go, no go. So this, on our case study, the two things that we looked at that have kind of gone through this process were our smart sequential flares and our impact detection system. And for our smart sequential flares, so what we were trying to do is we had a vendor that came by and they said, hey, we have these LED flares and they can go in sequence and they are smart, we can do it. And they had a patent on it, and we took a look at it. And part of our research was to look at other flares. So we looked at other vendors and other flares that were out there to kind of see, is this the product that makes sense for us to pilot? Is this what we want to look at? And those type of things. For our impact detection system, that's actually a sensor. That was something that we tried out. And we looked at what other sensors were out there and what kind of benefits those had. And by doing that initial research, there's a lot more buy-in. What we found out with the operations group and with everyone's like, okay, we aren't just looking at something, we're looking at what else is there. And then we have that documentation so that if anyone looks at it later, sometimes they can look at what these alternative options were. The next step was to develop a test plan. So then we look at some of the performance metrics that we had, expected outcomes. And this is a big part where we do a lot of our stakeholder engagement. So this was and that's really important to do really early on, is what we found, is just being able to show, hey, with our stakeholders, what do we want to test? What do we want to look at? We broke our tests down to 3 sections: our lab, controlled, and our field tests. So our lab tests were kind of like in our office or wherever, just testing the product at like a very controlled level. Our controlled tests were kind of trying to create a more real life example of something. And then our field was actually giving, the operators, hey, we kind of understand how this works, and doing a field test. So with the smart sequential flares, so for example, so those are basically LED flares, and they're like a little puck type thing, and you can pull them off of a case and they put them in sequence. And so one of the things that they said is these are really durable, and we asked the vendor, it's like, well, how durable are they? Because they need to be out on the road. And we actually did like an example of a crush test. So we actually ran it over with a Hero truck, which was kind of a fun thing to do. And it worked still. It still worked well. It was supposed to be waterproof, and we want these to work in the rain. And so we left it in a bucket of water for a while to see. They said it was going to last 24 hours as far as turning on. And so I think this is actually from, the picture is from, leaving them on and seeing how long they stayed on. So I think a lot of those control tests and doing that, and the lab tests, and then our control tests, and I'll go to the next one, was just to kind of do it out in the field, and then going toward that. And for the impact detection system, tape size thin, it was a sensor, and so it had kind of information about if we move the sensor, how much does it read, how quickly does it send us alerts, and kind of then testing against what the expected outcomes were. So this is from our actual pilot when we actually tested it out. So for the impact detection system, it's actually interesting. So the sensors were actually created to test on crash cushions, but we actually saw a need to maybe try. We heard that basically we have a lot of problems with grade strikes, and we actually wanted to see if this impact detection system, so this is basically a sensor that gives you information about how much something is moved, and we put it on our gates. So this is the express lane gates, and we just tried out a couple on there. And then we actually did, this one is from our flares situation. So the LED flares, and then we have it with cones. So there's 2 different things. So I'll show you guys the video. So on the left, you can actually see one of the things that came up was the flares as an option versus incendiary flares. It's like, well, are they bright enough? Can we still see them? So we just did a side-by-side comparison, and we actually timed them putting out like incendiary flares and actually putting out these LED flares instead. Talked to the Hero who we worked with about, which of these would work, does this work for your needs? What kind of issues do you see potentially happening? What kind of things do you see working well? And there's things that, I wouldn't think about, but like working with the Hero, it was like absolutely made sense. He's like, oh, if I put these out for a long closure, this will actually last a lot longer. The flares kind of burn out within 15 to 30 minutes. And for a lot of times when you have extended traffic control, you have to go out and put out more flares. And I wouldn't have thought of that. But then with the LED flares, it's like, well, this will last for 24 hours. So, you know, and basically any type of closure you have, that would work really well. So one of the other things that's really cool with these flares with the cones, so you actually see the sequential part of this. So what they do, like it actually like lights up so you can see that movement. So what's a little bit different about these flares versus other flares that were on the market was that this automatically puts up in sequence. And a lot of your sequential flares that exist, you actually have them numbered. These are smart, and they just, whichever one pulls off is the next one that goes, and there's several different patterns they can go through. Which was really, it was cool because a lot of times, so if one of them breaks or it gets mixed up, we've actually mixed them all up and they all work with just whichever one's closer. And because of that, they can actually go in chain. So if you need more than, so there's 10 in a pack. If there needs to be more, it actually works out that way. So you can actually see here when it's just lit up that it can also hold a steady light. So now in nighttime traffic control, those cones are a lot more visible. So those are some of the things that we did as we piloted the project. So with that, we always do analysis of what we did afterward, right? So we're testing that outcome, seeing, you know, does this work the way we thought it would? Calculating out some of that benefits and cost, and then preparing some of like our, like a high level cost estimate, getting a sense of from the vendors, you know, what would it cost to, you know, put this out there if we were to scale it. And we have a go, no go recommendation. And actually what was kind of interesting about these two pilots is, so what was interesting about these two pilots was that the flares, we were like, this actually worked really well, and, you know, Hero saw a benefit of it, and we said, you know, this would be a good one to go forward with. Whereas the impact detection system, they were, you know, really expensive sensors for not as much value. And there was kind of a bit of, it was good, cool, it was helpful to test out, it was helpful to know that there were sensors. And honestly, we said no go. But I think in the future, the documentation is really, you know, if there's a different application, this might make sense. Or, you know, if the cost of sensors go down, you know, sensor technology is something that is growing and is broadening. This is something you might want to consider in the future to see. So with that, you know, if we go past that no go no, we go over to deployment. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Roberto.
So, thanks, Mary. So from a deployment standpoint, the key here is, and I want to emphasize one thing that Mary suggested. The beauty of, I think, this pilot process specifically is that it gives the client, the agency GDOT here in this case, the opportunity to kind of phase this approach and decide whether or not they want to proceed and commit to any part of this project. So as early as after the research, and then obviously after testing, to make a determination on moving forward. To Mary's point on the impact detection system, we made a recommendation of no-go for several reasons, and it made sense for the department to not proceed any further, so things stopped there. So we did not go into this deployment phase. So, however, for the smart sequential flares, though, we made a recommendation to continue to move forward, given some of the success that we were seeing and the interest and need. So from a deployment standpoint, obviously coordination with stakeholders is critical, and I'm going to touch on some of this a little later as well. It's important to make sure that everyone's aware of what deployment specifically means, because it's more than just taking the existing pilot and making it operational. We now have a concept, we now have an opportunity to move forward, but we really can't just assume that it's in an operational production mode, if you will. So coordination with all stakeholders is critical, and like I said, I'm going to touch on that again here in a second. Develop the training materials. At this point, this is an opportunity to now start taking a look at what exactly it takes to really make these operational. Everything from training, everything from standard operating procedures, everything and anything related to that particular unit. So in the case of the smart sequential flares, I'm working with the Hero folks and developing and modifying existing SOPs was needed. We developed a high-level training plan and specific training materials that we went through as well with the department. And then determining what the scope of the actual implementation is and the deployment. So when you think about Hero in its full capacity, we're talking about 120 plus vehicles that are out there. We would have to make sure that we outfit for as many of those vehicles and those operators and backups. Well, Hero specifically did not want to necessarily go full deployment. So they said, we're going to stage this slowly. We want to move this in small phases, which makes sense. So obviously determining the scope and working with stakeholders within that, this phase particularly is important. And then there's the handoff project closeout phase, something that gets a little lost sight of. Because again, once it's turned over and deployment plans are established and put in place, we can easily walk away. But there's a little bit more to that we want to make sure we speak to. I talked about establishing the SOPs. In the deployment phase, we would have identified what they were. In the handoff, we would actually establish them and make sure that they get communicated and moved up the line. Conducting initial training is critical as well. In the case of Hero, and there's some pictures there of some of the training that was conducted, it was really do initial training to those operators that were going to make use of the flares in the field as part of their overall testing. But it also implies potentially train the trainer or phasing out a training approach and plan for the entire fleet of operators. Again, that's something that's negotiated and discussed early on. And I skipped, I guess, the first one, identifying champions. Maybe I didn't speak to that, but I think it is critical to also note that during the pilot process, I think there is visibility. You have the right people engaged for the most part. But once it goes to deployment and handoff, we want to make sure that it continues to move forward and carry forth. And obviously, the standard fare of providing all documentation and materials required moving forward. So this is what I want to talk to you a little bit real quickly. Some of the lessons learned. Maintaining realistic timelines is something that's important in any technology project. I've been in and around technology projects forever, so I'm very much aware of what it means to try to maintain realistic timelines. Well, within a pilot project, one of the things that we found specifically was that it's not something that's necessarily what do you call it, something that needs to be implemented. It's a nice to have. It's something in parallel to something else or in place to replace something. So trying to maintain realistic timelines is critical. We found, or we wanted to really anxiously move forward pretty quickly, so we built a fairly aggressive timeline, just assuming that this was, everyone's focus. Not necessarily the case. You can't necessarily just pull people off the field and say, start using our flares instead of incendiary flares out while they're trying to manage major incidents. It's not practical. Engaging everybody to coordinate with stakeholders and getting their input and feedback is not easy. They have full-time jobs. Again, this is somewhat extra. So maintaining realistic timelines is critical. I will share that I think our initial timeline was probably at a high level, somewhere in the 6-month range. The smart sequential flares is still somewhat ongoing. We're in the handoff phase now because it took a lot longer than everyone expected. And it wasn't because of delays on anyone's part. It was just a matter of, again, this is an extra effort overall, and it gets prioritized amongst everything else. That's critical. Including relevant stakeholders. Mary spoke to this a little earlier as well, but I want to emphasize the fact that it's got to be all-inclusive. It's more than the department or the users that are considered the stakeholders. It's more than your champions. It touches other things. Things that we learned specifically was, well, when we get to deployment, what does it mean to procure these things? We just wanted to turn over to the department, now go buy 1,000 of these units. Well, that's not practical. We need to really work with the department to help them identify what the procurement plan options are. Bring in procurement, bring in legal, bring in IT, the technology arm as well, because they have a lot to say about anything technology related. So making sure that everyone's involved is huge. I mentioned identifying procurement options. That's part of the stakeholders. Manage the operational priority. Again, as I mentioned earlier, from a pilot project perspective, that in and of itself had to get reprioritized constantly with so many other initiatives. But managing it now from a deployment perspective is critical. And this one was a major topic for us, or a major lesson learned for us during the time that this pilot project was in the heart of it, because the department was undergoing many initiatives that were much more important than this pilot. So it was a challenge. So just making sure that we manage that priority accordingly and apply it to the timeline is critical. Mary mentioned this as well, seeking alternative applications. The impact detection system was a great example of where it's a sensor-based technology that allows us to measure impacts. It was meant for attenuators and things of that nature. We really tried as best as possible to see how well they would work with gates. We found that the configuration of those units, the tweaking that was required, the fact that you go to one gate arm to another potentially would be just horrendous from getting it implemented, let alone the costs associated to it. Doesn't mean it's a bad technology. Doesn't mean that it can't be used for other purposes. One thing we found in part of our discussions with stakeholders at GDOT was, hey, could this be put like on sign structures that get constantly hit? Perhaps. I mean, so there's other applications potentially for this technology. So don't lose sight of it. So seeking alternative applications is key. And then lastly, I don't have a slide for this. I couldn't put enough bullets on it, so I'll just speak to it. We have an upcoming pilot that's sitting in Georgia DOT's queue right now that we spoke to earlier as well, and that's putting cameras on safety service patrol vehicles. We're planning on putting PTZ cameras as part of a pilot on the Hero vehicles, potentially Champ. I'm not sure where that sits just yet, where the TMC operations staff will be capable of actually taking control of these cameras and getting visibility without impacting the drivers or the operators themselves. The goal is to not have them do anything further than their current job, but really use this as a tool for the TMC for better visibility in remote areas, and more importantly, to get visibility where there are major incidents where we just don't have that and could get firsthand knowledge of what's going on a scene. So, and I think that wraps it up. So with that said, I'll open it up to questions if we have time.
Testing.
Should we get this in here? Wait, what's the? You want?
For the cones that light up, just curious, how do you start calculating the benefit side of that calculation for the benefit cost ratio?
Sure. So actually in our research, one of the things that we had looked at was there was actually a lot of studies on what kind of incidents really benefit from that kind of traffic control and that sequence. So that's something that like right now, the cones don't have any kind of sequence, any kind of movement. And actually, so they had done a study and they really looked, so having sequential cones and showing that movement of traffic is really beneficial in new traffic patterns as well as like an incident, right? So something that people aren't used to. So and that was kind of interesting to know too. So like for large construction projects, that's not as helpful because people just get familiar with it. But for something like, which is perfect for an incident, right? So looking at that, so basically with that cost benefit, really looking at what research has been done on that level and kind of using some of those numbers to look at that, and also recognizing that that is a benefit that is not currently being used at all. So those two things kind of putting that in place for what that is.
And may I add one more thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
And just speaking about cost specifically, one of the things we looked at early on was the use of incendiary flares and when they expire, how long they're sitting out there. And there's costs associated to that as well. That was considered, I think, early on. From a benefit standpoint, it became, is it beneficial to purchase hardware that could be constantly reused, that doesn't necessarily have an expiration time limit in comparison to the cost with maintaining incendiary flares that go bad on you?
And I think just to add to that, one of the other things that benefits with that, and we haven't figured out a way to necessarily quantify this benefit, but one of the things that did come up was incendiary flares don't work in the rain. LED flares do, right? So like maybe looking at starting to get an idea of how many incidents, and right now obviously like these flares really only use at night, like in daytime you can see, and the flares don't really show up. But how many situations do you have raining conditions and dark conditions where a flare might have been useful to provide visibility, but now you couldn't use it in an incendiary flare. Now you have an opportunity to use an LED flare. So, but we don't have the true calculations of how much, because that's not something you've been tracking. But that's part of one of those things that going forward, as you look at it at a long-term scale, it's like we know that there is a benefit. We don't know how much that is, but figuring out a way to quantify that. Stephen?
Are you typically testing one technology at a time? How does the pilot program work? Are there multiple technologies that you're looking at for different applications at the same time, or?
So there are multiple. So these two we did kind of they were kind of staggered from each other, but we did start them at the same time. So while we were, I think, like the research had been done for the flares and we were kind of in the test plan development, that's when we started doing research for the impact detection system. So it really is, it kind of comes down to the scale of some of these pilots. So some of them are a lot larger and more involved. With like the impact detection system, we had to work with ITS maintenance and, work with them to say like, hey, where can we put this? Can we get this out there? So it's sometimes, and I think that's part of the schedules and building that out is, and kind of what Roberto was talking about with those realistic timelines, looking at, who do we all need to coordinate with? How many stakeholders are involved? How much do we have? And we can do as many as like kind of the capacity allows, and also the prioritization, right? These are the wants to have, these are the we want to explore. And the thing there too is I think many agencies and GDOT especially, like, you want to be at a point where you have space to explore. You have space to do some research and innovation in a way that doesn't take as much risk. Right, so it's kind of a how far do you want to go, and how much can you take on with all the other things that you're doing.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
So, say you have I probably won't even need it. Say you have a technology and maybe it
Steven,
applies
it's
to,
for the live stream. And
oh,
those
sorry.
things,
Yeah.
they
Okay.
can't.
All right. So maybe you have a technology that applies to more than one agency, because it looks like based on the wheel that you had on one of your earlier slides, you're covering things like CERTA, GMA, all these state organizations. Maybe talk a little bit about the process of how do you identify other organizations within the state that the technology could potentially have applications to. Are there stakeholders from each of these state organizations that get involved with the pilot program, and then they kind of say, oh, I could use that for X, Y, or Z, or is that on the group that's actually doing the analysis for the pilot to make the determination that there could be applicability to other agencies?
So because this is done through, and Roberto can speak to some of this as well, but because this is done through the Georgia DOT, it's kind of being housed there. But we do have connections to other counties and other things. And so what ends up happening a lot of times is we start hearing about where other stakeholders are doing it, and then they start kind of just sharing that information. I found out that, like, during our hero training, they mentioned that I think Lumpkin County Fire Department uses it. And so I think it's just kind of getting that visibility is really, so there's not like a formal process to getting it to all these other agencies and groups, but it's more of a word of mouth. And then as you get that, it's getting those contacts and being able to, and then there's that documentation. And that was a big part of this versus previous pilots. There wasn't necessarily as much documentation about what worked, what didn't, why it worked for our group or didn't work. But now there's a lot more documentation that we can potentially share.
I haven't ever seen a flare. Is it an actual fire?
Yeah, so the incendiary flares, yeah, so what they do is they kind of have this edge, and they kind of like spark it, yeah, and then they light the flare, and it's out on the road.
But if vehicles hit it,
Yeah,
could there be a bigger fire?
yes.
Yeah, so that's actually a little worse than if you had the LED flares.
Right, and that was one of the benefits. So, like, actually, that is something that they had mentioned. So, one of the things when they do those flares, there's a lot about making sure where they are on the road. One of the things they had talked about is that the flares, the way they're shaped, they roll sometimes, which isn't great. And then there's been times that, like, things can catch on fire, which can be, and that's part of one of the reasons that we started looking at LED flares was not only, the safety of, like, people and being able to see, but also improving the safety toward, the first responders who are using these flares. It is a lot safer for them to use an LED flare than it is for them to use a flame.
Right. The other thing I wondered, what other products have y'all tested for incident management? Is there anything else besides the flares that y'all looked at?
So the next one that we're coming up with is that the cameras and the mounted, and we've looked at different
the
technologies,
cameras.
right?
Okay.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so sometimes it's kind of a, which ones make sense to do, and kind of staggering it in a way that they're not overwhelmed by, like, try all these 10 things.
Yeah.
So
right.
it's and that's right, getting that buy-in and working on that. So right now, the only thing we've tested so far with them has been the flares, but then the mounted cameras are the next one coming up.
So this is really an ongoing
Absolutely.
project. Yeah.
It's multiple ongoing projects. Essentially.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, did you all do a review of the surrounding states to see what kind of technologies that they're implementing from a TIMS perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, one of the earliest we had a meeting with Florida DOT because they actually are using mounted cameras on their safety service patrol. So that was one of the states we had talked to with the flares. They are actually, the vendor is actually based out in California. So that was one of the groups that we had talked to. And the cameras are used in another state, right? Indiana. So we're trying to set up a meeting with Indiana. Oh, we have the meeting set. Oh, sorry. Roberto can speak. Roberto can speak to that more. But so Indiana has been doing the cameras as well. So we have been talking, and that's a big part of that research phase, right? That's that research phase where we're looking at what's that background research, like what research papers, what universities have done studies, also what other states have already kind of implemented this or similar technologies. And that, again, leads into that buy-in and knowing and learning the lessons that the other states have done. Actually, so one of the things that we looked at with the impact detection systems and the gates, Florida actually does have sensors on their managed lane skates. It's a different type of sensor, but so we knew that was an application that was possible. Hello? Tom?
Yeah, and maybe you can answer this question, maybe you can't. I don't want you to step on anybody's toes. Is there anything that you see coming up, any technologies that you're really excited about, you or Roberto are really excited about, or is there anything that you've had to, pass on for one reason or another that you really wish you were able to have implemented?
Lots of technologies that I think are worthwhile investigating. I wouldn't say there's anything necessarily in the queue. I mean, I could speak about a number of things that I'd be personally interested in pursuing, but it's all about making sure that there's a right business application, a real operational efficiency gain within incident management, and that personally, again, from my perspective, I have not aligned those two yet. I think what I'm doing is building a large queue of technology options, hardware, software. I'm trying to engage vendors to also bring forth some thoughts about some of the toys that may be coming down the line, because I think that's where we come in and try to see where they fit within Georgia DOT, where it fits within incident management. As far as passing on things, I don't think, I've been on this contract for a couple years, so I can't say we've personally passed on anything just yet. I mean, the impact detection and the smart sequential flares was already kind of beyond research phase when I started, when it came for the CCTV for SSP. As much as that's been an interest of ours for quite a long time, it's certainly GDOT's interest as well. So that was kind of brought forth to us, or it was kind of in concert. But I do encourage folks, if there are things out there, to reach out to us. We'll be more than happy to have a conversation and brainstorm a little bit, because that's a part of the whole purpose behind the research and innovation arm.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Roberto, for the presentation today. If you had any closing remarks, I don't want to cut you off.
No.
All right, perfect.
Thanks,
Thanks, everybody, for coming. Just a reminder, please. Thank you. Just a reminder, the annual meeting registration is live. There will be an image up there in nowish and go and magic. Okay, well, I guess I'm not. So you should have just gotten an email in your inbox regarding it, so you can check that out. If we can get there we go. So we have the QR code up there. We really have some great content this year. We have a great technical program lined up. We have a great keynote speaker. So really look forward to seeing y'all and enjoying some time on the beach with y'all. All right. Thank y'all for coming. We'll see you next month.